I'm Charles Krasner, Chair of the Fair Housing and Diversity Committee. Please join me in welcoming Steve Tomkowiak, the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Metro Detroit. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here to introduce the following presentation created by our committee, spliced together from the works of a number of great resources, some of which you may be familiar with. Our goal is to provide you with useful information to help you navigate the many issues realtors may encounter related to fair housing and to inspire you to take action. We are proud of our commitment to fair housing and invite everyone to join us in that commitment today and every day by being all in for fair housing and diversity. Thank you.
We need to talk about race. Why are people protesting? Why are people angry? Slavery ended 150 years ago. The civil rights movement was 60 years ago. Racial discrimination is illegal now. Heck, we even had a black president. So why are people still upset? These are two households in America. One is black, the other is white. Today, the average black household has 60% of the income of the average white household, but only 1/10 of the household wealth. Why does that matter? Well, household wealth helps send kids to school, helps launch small businesses, stabilizes loss of income, and helps families survive catastrophic events like divorce or unemployment. What's amazing about this number is that there are lots of extremely wealthy African Americans, movie stars, pop stars, 75% of the NBA, 70% of the NFL, Oprah, Tyler Perry, Ben Carson, Morgan Freeman, and there are a lot of extremely poor white families. Think of Appalachia and other parts of rural America. But even when we factor all that in, the average black household still has only 1/10 the wealth of the average white household. How did that happen? Well, here we go. What happened after we freed the slaves, after the Civil War ended? 9 states enacted vagrancy laws, making it a crime to not have a job. The law was applied only to black men. 8 of those states then allowed prisoners, the black men who'd just been arrested for not having a job, to be hired out to plantation owners with little or no pay going to the prisoners themselves. So, that's right, men who had been freed from the plantations found themselves right back on the plantations. Additional laws prohibited mischief and insulting gestures, which allowed more black men to be arrested and created a huge market for convict leasing. Working conditions for these leased convicts could be worse than slavery because the plantation owner leasing the black prisoner had no long-term interest in his well-being. At the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had mandated racial segregation by law, Jim Crow laws, which supported a social ostracism for blacks that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels and restaurants, hospitals, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. White politicians competed with each other to be more strict and specific on segregation. For example, a law prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. No interracial chess playing. That might lead to lawn darts. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that these Jim Crow laws were perfectly legal because they, quote, reflected customs and traditions and, quote, preserved public peace and good order. These laws stayed in place until 1954, when the idea of separate but equal was struck down in the ruling known as Brown versus Board of Education. So what happened next after Brown? Well, in 1956, the Southern Manifesto was signed by 101 out of 128 Congress members from the South, pledging to maintain Jim Crow by all means possible. 5 states passed nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws after 1954. Private whites-only schools, dubbed segregation academies, popped up all across the South, many of them Christian. But now widespread civil rights protests, combined with anti-war protests that were occasionally becoming violent, inspired the political rise of law and order rhetoric. Richard Nixon became the first candidate to campaign specifically on a platform of law and order. In 1968, 81% of Americans agreed that law and order had broken down in this country, and the majority blamed communists and Negroes who start riots. Let's go back to household wealth. The average black household has 1/10 the wealth of the average white household. Why is that? Because the number one source of intergenerational wealth in America is home ownership. And from the 1930s to well into the 1960s, the federal government enacted policies to actively encourage white families to own homes and discourage black families from doing the same.
The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration developed a program to guarantee loans for working-class families to purchase homes. But there was a catch. Those loans were not available to people of color. If you were Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, the guarantees for loans weren't available at all. And if you were a white family and you were interested in moving into an integrated neighborhood, those loans weren't available to you either.
In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration created a risk rating system to determine which neighborhoods were safe investment for federally backed mortgages. Black neighborhoods were deemed too risky, marked off in maps with red ink, in a practice now known as redlining. After World War II, a boom of new suburban housing was built all over the country, much of it restricted by deed to whites only. In 1948, 40% of new housing developments in Minneapolis, for example, had covenants prohibiting purchase by African Americans. So blacks couldn't live in white neighborhoods and couldn't get federally insured loans for black neighborhoods. Until 1950, the Realtor's Code of Ethics specifically prohibited selling a house in a white neighborhood to a non-white family. You could lose your realtor's license if you helped a black family buy a home in a white neighborhood. In the 1930s, the FHA's underwriting manual said, quote, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. The FHA went on to recommend that highways would be a great way to separate black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. The FHA funded huge white-only suburban housing developments, leaving blacks behind in inner cities. After World War II, the GI Bill provided subsidized mortgages to help millions of men returning from war to buy their first home. While technically eligible for the GI Bill, the way it was administered left 1 million black veterans largely on the outside looking in. In New York and New Jersey, the GI Bill insured more than 67,000 new mortgages. Fewer than 100 of those went for homes purchased by non-whites. In 1947, there were 3,200 mortgages in Mississippi guaranteed by the government for returning veterans. Of the 3,200, only 2 went to black veterans. As a result, white families after the war were able to build home equity, growing wealth for retirement, inheritance, and college education for their kids. One historian has stated that there was no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill.
So the government had a great deal to do with hardening segregation. But as many of you know, the real estate industry itself also played a role.
The practice of blockbusting, the process by which real estate brokers convinced white homeowners to sell their properties at below market rates due to fears of racial change in their neighborhoods. Brokers then made profits by reselling the same home at higher prices to customers who were not white. Tactics included door-to-door and telephone solicitations, the dissemination of leaflets saying minorities had purchased property nearby, that schools were going to change and that effective policing was no longer possible. Phone calls in which a caller would apologize for a misdial and then indicate he was trying to reach the black family who had just moved in, and obtaining numerous listings and then using for sale signs to indicate that a neighborhood was changing. A 1971 Chicago Tribune article featured anecdotes from brokers who engaged in the following tactics. Quote, we don't care if the whites run all the way to Hong Kong, as long as they run. I go where the money is. It's good for business when they're frightened. Quote, Chicago Avenue is the demarcation line right now, but one of these days, some black will move north of Chicago Avenue. When one of them jumps, that's the green light. Then it's open season.
Our local history is ripe with examples of discriminatory practices and racism. 1943, deep social unrest from the poor living conditions, inequalities, and racism made more apparent by the prosperity that came from the arsenal of democracy known as Detroit erupted in the summer in a brutal clash. In the 1940s, particularly as soldiers returned from fighting abroad, many sought to distance themselves from the social unrest and urban setting of the big city. This started what is referred to as white flight. In 1945, the Grosse Pointe Broker Association established the first version of the point system, developed as a questionnaire to be given to all prospective new residents of the Grosse Pointe community. It prevented many from buying homes in the area, including Italians, Jews, and any person of color. In 1967, social unrest again erupted in the well-known Detroit riots. Following the Detroit riots, a huge wave of white flight occurred, with the largest being 80,000 people moving from Detroit in 1968. Still in that year, partially in response to the mass exodus of Detroit, the state of Michigan signed into law the Michigan Fair Housing Act. Meanwhile, on a national level, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. Also in 1968, the Grosse Pointe Brokers Association was forced to end the discriminatory practice known as the point system due to a court case after 23 years of use. In 1976, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act was signed into law, expanding on the protections given and strengthening the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. Understanding the past helps to inform our future. Discrimination, racism, and implicit bias are still occurring today, which makes fair housing relevant and important to all realtors, even in the 21st century.
But why are we still separated by race, by ethnicity? Why are our neighborhoods still so homogeneous? Why, if we have children, do they go to school with kids who look mostly like them? Wasn't this the whole point, the Fair Housing Act of 1968? What's getting in the way?
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
What is bias? This brings us to the concept of bias. A bias is a preference for or an aversion against a group of people. And preferences for a particular group can be as powerful because accumulated advantage over time has an enormous effect. Implicit bias refers to the brain's automatic association of stereotypes and attitudes toward particular groups, often without our conscious awareness. We use the phrase implicit rather than unconscious because even when we're conscious of these biases, they still emerge automatically, instantly in our brains. And that's why they're so powerful. Implicit bias. Having an implicit bias doesn't mean we have to act on it. Every human being has implicit biases toward a range of groups, and implicit biases exist toward all the different identities we have, because of course none of us consist of a single identity. So implicit biases exist according to race and ethnicity, which is what we've been talking about, but also gender, sexual orientation, age, ability status, religion. And as you can see, many of these are the exact categories the Fair Housing Act covers. And that's part of the reason why we have to be mindful that how we think we're behaving might not be how we're actually behaving. Our decisions might be being guided by these associations we have in our brains that are, again, inconsistent with our values as humans.
So where are we? The average black household has 1/10 the wealth of the average white household. This didn't happen by accident. It happened by policy. We, the majority culture, told them where they could live and where they couldn't. Then we moved most of the jobs to the places we told them they couldn't live. When the predictable explosion of unemployment and poverty resulted in a predictable increase in drug use and crime, we criminalized the problem. We built $19 billion of new jails and sold grenade launchers to the police. As a result, a white boy born in America today has a 1 in 23 chance of going to prison in his lifetime. For a black boy, it's 1 in 4. And that is why people are angry. What am I asking you to do? Care.
Good morning. This is Bobby D. Lewis, and on behalf of all members of the Grosse Pointe Board of Realtors Fair Housing and Diversity Committee, thank you for joining us. We ask that you think about what you have seen and the information that we have shared with you today. Our goal was not only to provide you with useful information that will help your business navigate the many issues that we, as realtors, may encounter related to fair housing, but also to inspire you to take action. Here are just a few suggestions. Make fair housing discussions a part of your regular agent broker meetings. Encourage frank, open discussion about fair housing so that agents and others are comfortable raising concerns or issues that they will encounter in the marketplace. Set a goal or plan to expand your customer base to consciously seek out and farm for a diverse population of buyers and sellers. And remember, if you have a question related to fair housing, please contact the Fair Housing Center of Metro Detroit at 313-963-1274. That number again, Fair Housing Center of Metro Detroit, 313-963-1274. Thank you.